Today, Salim Mansur is here. He's going to be sharing his extensive knowledge on, and I've been listening to him for some time now, and I want to say his very precise and his memory is, whenever I listen to you, Salim, it's really your memory that that you know of that you contain, that you hold. That memory is just so important, and the bringing that into the present to share, I just think that is just so important, especially for right now. So I'd like to ask you to just give us a little bit of a background, just briefly what your background is, and just so that people can understand, where you're coming from.
First of all, thank you so much, Illia. I hope I can call you Illia.
Oh, yes.
Thank you very much, Illia, for inviting me on this program. And I'm looking forward to our conversation. To begin with, as you say, my background, very briefly, I am a Canadian of Indian origin. I was born in Calcutta. I came to Canada in the early 70s when I was just out of my teenage years. I was in my early 20s. And I settled and became a Canadian. I was in Toronto in the 70s. I went to university in Toronto, and I worked my way through the university. Graduated with a PhD in political economy, and I went to Ottawa, where I spent a few years. That was the last years of Prime Minister Pierre Elliott Trudeau. He had founded, through a parliamentary motion, the Canadian Institute for International Peace and Security. And the first executive director of that institute was Geoffrey Pearson, who was a diplomat by profession. He had retired after having come back as an ambassador from Moscow. And he took over the institute, where I ended up being a research associate working for Mr. Pearson. Now, Mr. Pearson was the only son of our former Prime Minister, Lester Pearson, who also had been Canada's Minister for External Affairs before he became Prime Minister in 1963. So I was there in Ottawa at that institute for, as I said, a few years. And from there, in 1986, I came to London, Ontario, southwestern Ontario, in an appointment in the Department of Political Science at University of Western Ontario. And I made my home here in London, and I retired a few years ago, just before the outbreak of the COVID pandemic, or COVID scamdemic, whichever way you want to call it. That was at the end of 2019. So I'm now retired. And I had also, while I was at the university, beginning in Ottawa and then through my university career, I was also a regular opinion op-ed contributor to various papers and journals in the context of issues and events in terms of foreign policy and domestic policy that came up while I was there, and I wrote and ended up being a nationally syndicated columnist for the Sun media, and then all of that is finished and done with in the official sense. I'm just completely liberated, and we can talk about that in due course. But I still write. I publish in Substack, and occasionally I do podcasts with friends. And here I am with you.
Would you share a little bit further about the circumstances, your personal circumstances prior to coming to Canada?
Well, yes. I came to Canada in the spring of 19. Arrived as a landed resident or permanent resident in those days. That was called. But I came out of India as a refugee, a war refugee, a refugee from a genocide. That was, a long time ago. But people have forgotten about that. I was a teenager when all of this happened. India, was a part of the British Empire, what was branded as the crown jewel of the British Empire. And then, after the Second World War, immediately after the Second World War, the new government that came to office after the election in May 1945, when Prime Minister Churchill lost the election, and the new government that came in was the Labour government of Prime Minister Clement Attlee. And one of the first major announcement of his government was that Britain is going to leave India and India will become independent. And Britain left India or handed over power less than 2 years later to India. But India got partitioned, divided. That is, one India became now two countries, two independent countries, India and Pakistan. And Pakistan was a sort of a geographically a country that was divided between what is India, that was made. So there was the western half of Pakistan, which is today called Pakistan. It remains by the name Pakistan. And there was an eastern half of Pakistan on the east of India, that is the independent India, that was called East Pakistan. And Pakistan and India, as a result of the partition, that is the dividing of India, were born in a state of conflict. It was a cultural, religious conflict. A united India, at that time, around about 450 million people, was majority Hindu population, minority Muslim population. So of the 450 million people, excuse me, some 75% of the people belong to the Hindu tradition, and the balance, 25%, the largest portion of that balance, 25%, were Muslims, and then the rest were Buddhists, Christians, Zoroastrians, and animists, that is, other primitive religions. But the Muslims were the largest of the minorities, and the British decided on the demands of the Muslims of India, or a segment of the Muslims of India, not all, that they need to have their own country. And on that basis, on the divisions or the divide, the differences in terms of religious values, India was divided. Now, to make sense of that, or to make an analogy of that, we in Canada, we have been having this problem for the past so many years, going back to um, the period after World War One. The period after Prime Minister Wilfrid Laurier. That is the growing identity, in a sense, a national identity based upon language and religion, that is Catholicism and French, in Quebec. And that identity and the politics around that identity emerged through the Quiet Revolution in the 1940s and 50s into a demand for the separation of Quebec and Quebec becoming independent. So we have a very complex history. Either people are aware of it or people have forgotten about it. And that division between French and English has been one of the motifs in the story of Canada. And if Canada ends up, for whatever reason, it came very close to ending up in the referendum of 1980, and if a majority of Quebecers had voted for separation, then Canada would have gone through a partition. Now, all the French Canadians, presumably, if such a vote took place, if such a referendum took place, would have voted for breaking Canada and separating from Canada. But if a majority voted for it, Canada would have a huge problem. And a second referendum was tried in the 1990s. And again, the party, the Quebec party, pushing for separation, Parti Québécois, lost that referendum also by a small vote. So we have this problem in this country. India went through that problem, and Britain partitioned India. I was not born at that time. That was my father's generation, my grandparents' generation, my mother's generation. So when India was divided, the people got divided, and the people had to move. Those who couldn't stay in one place for whatever reason, that is of their own sense of belonging, they had to move. They either moved to Pakistan from India, or they moved from the areas that became Pakistan into India. So there was a huge, massive transfer of population. And my parents' generation were in that way affected. And so part of the family, my mother and father, ended up in Pakistan, but their home was in India. So their parents, their relatives, that is the extended family, became divided. 20 plus years later, when I was a teenager, there was a problem between the two parts of Pakistan, two halves of Pakistan, again, based upon linguistic divisions, just as in Canada, French and English. So in Pakistan, it was the language problem. One side of the country, that is West Pakistan, they insisted upon that the language of Pakistan will be Urdu and Urdu alone. Urdu is a language that is derived from Persian, Arabic, Turkish language. And the people of East Pakistan, the majority, they insisted, no, if there's going to be an official language, it has to be the language of East Pakistan, which was and is Bengali. Bengali is a language that is Sanskritic. It is like saying that French is a Romance language and Italian is a Romance language, and they are the same language. And it is not true. It is not correct. They're both a Romance language, European Romance language, but French is French and Italian is Italian. And so is Spanish. In Canada, English and French. So this conflict, political conflict between two people in the same country, divided by language, ended up fighting. And the fight, which was led by or ignited by partisans of either language, ended up under the control of the military. And the military control led to a genocide when the military tried to put down by force the demands that had erupted. And it was a massive genocide. According to estimates, and people either agree or disagree, that is, people in that part of the world where this genocide took place, 3 million people died as a result of the killings, and over 10 million people became refugees. That is, the people in East Pakistan. The military was based in West Pakistan. Now, this genocide and this refugee problem that erupted in 1970-71 ended up in a war between India and Pakistan, the 1971 war. And at the end of the war, the Pakistan army was defeated by the Indian army, and Pakistan was divided. East Pakistan became Bangladesh. West Pakistan remained Pakistan, but no longer West. It is Pakistan. So at that time, when this genocide and war took place, I was lucky. A lot of people that I know, my fellow students, I was then in college. I'd graduated from the high school and had just gone into first year college where we were living. And everything shut down. It was a war zone. And for whatever reason, that I was lucky, and my immediate family, my mother and my siblings, we were lucky not to have been physically eliminated. We were able to get away from that problem, that turmoil, that war, and get into India, go to India, where my grandparents' home in Calcutta still was there. And so we ended up there. And then we applied to get out of that part of the world. I had immediate family member in Canada, in America. They had come to Canada and America like immigrants from so many other parts of the world. Some came as students, some had come as students. My aunt, who was in Canada at that time, my father's younger sister, she had come to Canada in the 1960s with her husband and her children. They were veterans of the Second World War. My father's family, siblings, my uncles and others had volunteered in the Second World War. They had fought by being volunteers in the Indian Army, in the Indian Air Force, in the Indian Navy under the British. And after the war, a few years later, my aunt had migrated, as others did. Some went to England, some went to Australia. My aunt came to Canada in the 60s. So she sponsored us, that is me and my brother, on the basis of an urgency that we were refugees in India, which we were. and we got the certificates by the British High Commission in India to come to Canada. And so I came to Canada, and subsequently, when I had sort of graduated from the university, and my brother too, my older brother, who passed away a few years ago, we together sponsored my mother and my younger sister, and they came. And my mother made home in Canada, and she passed away in Canada, in Toronto. And my sisters, they got married and they made their lives and they moved on. One of my sister is in United States. Another sister is here in Toronto area. Both of them went on to become teachers and doctors, and so on. And that's the story of immigrants from all around the world, the story of all immigrants in North America or in Europe. For me, as I said, I'm a Canadian. I refuse to consider myself a hyphenated Canadian, and I wrote about that. I published a couple of books and essays and research papers. And I say, ethnically, I'm an Indian. Canada is a country of immigrants. The only difference is who came here early and who came late. But it's a country of immigrants, apart from the Aboriginal people, the First Nation. But a hyphenated identity doesn't do justice neither to Canada nor to the home country from wherever the immigrant has come. The immigrant came from wherever they came by leaving their origin behind to pick up a new identity, a new, commitment, a new loyalty, a new fact of who they are and who their children will be, and so on and so forth. So my children, I have a son and a daughter. I lost my son a few years ago in a massive car crash in the mountains up in BC, in Okanagan Valley. And I have a daughter, so I lost my son. And I have a daughter. Both of them are Canadian. They were born in Canada. And so I say, and I say, I hope others will also say that we're not hyphenated Canadians. We are Canadians. And so that's in a nutshell is the story. Now, the word story and the word memory that you started with, memory is the stories that we carry. The stories are encoded either in our mind, that is the living story of living people, individual, is encoded and retained in our minds. And that mind, as it gets older, starts losing. It's like a computer software. It starts losing its capacity to handle the information that has been encoded. And that's what happens when it starts losing its capacity to maintain what has been encoded. The individual start going to what we now know is amnesia. And when the capacity to maintain those encoded stories in the mind is totally lost, if a computer's software is totally become dysfunctional, then the software is erased, the mind is erased, and you can see if people run into or go to a hospital or an old folk home and you see an individual who has now reached the ultimate stage of amnesia, then what is that person? That person is now without a story. He or she can no longer recall who he or she is, cannot recall their name, cannot recall their past, immediate past, and their past of who they are as a person, as a family, as a community, as a nation, is just simply a walking shell, right? So stories have to be encoded. That's in our memory. But stories also encoded in our body.
Mm-hmm.
What is the genome? The genome is the story of where we came from, who we are, our evolution. So memory is an extremely important thing because it is what makes us who we are. In fact, it is the singularly most important thing in a living person. And when memory goes into a state where the recollection of those encoded story begins to get lost by an individual, the individual becomes a shell. By a group, by a nation, that nation loses its own sense of who that nation is or what it was. You know, so ironically, our current prime minister says that Canada is a post-national state with no core identity. In other words, Canada has no memory of how it came about, no core identity. So we are now, I refuse to accept, by the way, that definition, and I imagine you refuse to it, and I imagine most thinking people. But officially, this is what the prime minister says. We have no core identity. In other words, he's saying now we are in a collective amnesia. We have no story of our own, in contrast to the story of the United States. To take an example, the story of the United States is bound up with the Pilgrim Father, with the 1776 revolution, with the making of the Constitution, with the Civil War, and the story goes on because each of us add to that story. And each of us recollect from that story the sense of who we are, of how we are going to navigate through life.
Yes. The one thing that comes from that, for me, that last little bit about the Prime Minister's declaration, by sort of declaring that, then that's almost like creating like a blank slate, where a blank slate could then be easily programmed with whatever whatever is coming down from above. That reminds me of something I wrote down yesterday from your discussion with Mark Friesen this weekend, and you said the reincarnation of this global agenda. Those words from many of the words resonated with me, but those words really jumped out at me. Can you expand on that?
Yeah, I mean the central point is that memory is encoded somewhere, and in this example, that the computer disk where we encode the information is memory. So when we encode the memory on this compact disk or in the built-in disk in our computer that you and I are communicating, and it is being recorded, that means it is being encoded. And if for any number of reasons this encoding is lost, wholly or partially, then I suppose you will make some effort to get it back, you know. And if you cannot get it back, then that disk is now an empty disk. And a new set of information will go in, and the other previous memory is lost. So it will be an entirely new set of information, new set of data, new set of stories. So in the life of a person, that's what happens. if the memory is lost or the memory is affected, much of the mental health problem has a lot to do with the confusion of who the person is, right? Whether it is as a result of addiction to drugs, alcohol, or some external wound that has damaged the capacity of our brain, the functioning of the brain, then that person, that individual, is in some mental health problem and needs to be taken care of. And somehow the capacity to record, relate, understand, interpret his or her story has to be retrieved. And it's a process. That's the work of the neurosurgeons and the psychiatrists and so on and so forth. Because without memory, the individual is actually nobody. We now understand it far more than, for instance, Sigmund Freud, started his work on psychoanalysis. I mean, it is said that the modern age begins with the two modern age or modern times, that's the 20th century, end of the 19th century, and the beginning of the 20th century, and we are now in the 21st century. But the 20th century, modern times, begins with two great intellect. One, Sigmund Freud, two, Albert Einstein. Albert Einstein, in that sense, broke the mystery about the molecular facts of matter, that is, as a physicist. And his analysis, rather than discovery, his analysis, his work as a physicist, his mathematics, led to one of the most intriguing and most important equation to explain matter at the molecular level, which is E equal mc squared, right? Energy equal mass multiplied squared by the constant number, which is the speed of light. So here you and I, we are talking, and at the heart of this apparatus, this movement of my voice and my image to your camera, and your voice and your image to my camera, separated by 3,000 miles at an instant of time, in a nanosecond. When you start analyzing what is behind this, what is the physics of this, you somehow go back to Einstein's equation. That's where the explanation lies. Now, before this was all brought together, if somebody said that Illia sitting in that beautiful surrounding in the foothills of the Rocky Mountains in BC, and I sitting in my own cave here in southwestern Ontario, are engaged in an instant communication where we are winking at each other, talking with each other, then they would say, you're talking about magic. It cannot happen. Because that would, people say, what you're saying is simply a fiction. A lot of fiction has become reality, the fiction about flying. Jules Verne, the French writer, wrote about around the world in 80 days, flying, in a balloon. We can go around the world in 80 minutes or less, and it's not a fiction, it is a reality. And that is the work of physics. The other huge development was Sigmund Freud, I mentioned. And Sigmund Freud's work was, his most famous book was The Interpretation of Dreams. So dealing with patients, Sigmund Freud was dealing with patients. That means all those medical doctors in the middle 19th century. Freud was born in the mid 19th century. And that means patients right through history, men and women whose external symptom was hysteria of some sort. That is a mental health problem of variations. And how to treat them, or what it is to diagnose them. Well, the easiest way was to dismiss them as being witches or some sort of a diabolical creature, or that some demon had taken them over, for what they were saying, how they were behaving, conducting themselves, etc., etc. Well, with Sigmund Freud began the search of trying to understand what it is. And the long and the short of it is that he came up with the argument, the hypothesis, and then he experimented with it, which is that what an individual imagines he's seeing, that is dream, are actually encoded memories, and it has to be read to understand what it is. It's coming back, haunting that person. A child traumatized at a young age, now in his adolescent years or in his middle age or whatever time period, suddenly this person, man or woman, is haunted by dreams of what had happened to him when he was a child, what was done to him when he was a child, or she was a child. And he cannot get rid of it. He cannot explain it. He acts out in weird ways, weird in the sense he's no more normal when those things come into his head. And Freud discovered the means of reaching into the mind of those individuals affected by this disorder. And that became psychoanalysis, psychotherapy, recollecting, reinterpreting, retelling the story. And once the child, now an adult, recognizes through the process of psychotherapy, psychoanalysis, that these dreams are the trauma that he went through with his parents or with his community or whatever the circumstances, once he recognizes and he recalls, as the patient is put through that process of recollection, and he comes out of it, he is cured. That's the therapy. The therapy is the recollection of memory. Now he can handle the problem. That is one of the terms, or one of the cure was identified as what Freud said, Oedipus complex. Oedipus complex, of course, he took the name out of that famous tragedy of Sophocles from 4th, 3rd century BC. And what is the story of Sophocles, Oedipus? Here is the king that goes into his kingdom, Thebes, in ancient Greece, is going through a plague, and there is no cure found. Nothing is being found. People are dying, and so on and so forth. Well, this is the fiction that is being told in the drama. And finally, an old man comes in to Thebes and meets Oedipus and says to the king that the problem of Thebes, the plague of Thebes, happens to be Thebes is infected by a disease in which you are the central figure. And the long and the short of it is that the central figure, the king, Oedipus, was a child that was thrown away by his parents. And when he grew up by accident, he confronted his father in a field of conflict, killed his father, and married his mother. That was incest. The mother, Yocasta, did not know that the child, who is now a man, that she ends up marrying after her husband has been killed in the field of conflict, is actually her son. That is the discovery. That's the crime. That's the incest. When Oedipus learns that and he recognizes that, then what does he do? He then goes into repentance, penitent. He tears out his eyes. He cannot bear the thing. He walks away, and Thebes in this story recovers from the plague. The metaphor is the recovery takes place by the recovery of the memory of what was the disease in Thebes that brought about the plague. So these are all metaphors, but within the metaphor is the main theme, which is what Freud took up and identified. The child sexually abused, children sexually abused. That's why pedophilia is a crime and should be a crime and remain a crime. Children abused sexually are going to suffer and will suffer until that abuse and their understanding of that abuse is brought out through a process of therapy and they're renormalized.
And perpetuates as well.
Yeah.
It perpetuates, right?
Exactly. So in other words, a lot of people have written about these matters. Since Freud, of course, psychiatry has become a medical science in which there is psychoanalysis, but the treatment more and more is done chemically, through chemical process. But still, if you go to a doctor, any doctor with a problem, health problem, what does the doctor do? What does the physician do? The first thing the physician do is sits you down and wants to know your story. Were you smoking? Do you drink? What happened? If you're having problem breathing, the physician wants to know. And if you have been smoking, you have affected your lungs. If in whatever manner some external fact has disrupted your normal function of your organs, your mind, whoever is the person that is suffering from disorder, whether it is the disorder of the mind, mental disorder, or it is a physical disorder. And the physician has to know. And that is recollection of the story, which is encoded, or has been encoded in your mind and in your physical body. If your bone has been broken, the doctor wants to know, the physician wants to know, how was this bone broken? That broken bone encodes the memory of what happened. Mm-hmm. You were playing some sort of a game, you're going down skiing or whatever. And then, that is the doctor applies the appropriate process to heal the damage done, to repair your bones.
It's interesting that you bring up memory. Part of the work that I do is recovering the memory, suppressed memory, whether it be through trauma or for whatever reason. I like, what Jung said, what we resist persists. So that's a really general statement to describe it. But what is happening is that it's suppressed beneath the conscious memory, the conscious mind. and by you know, even the willingness to allow that to come forth brings that memory to the surface and brings that emotion to the surface and the language that goes with it. We call it the creative principles. So it's the language, the emotion, and the memory, which is there through thought, resisted thought.
Exactly. And so there is this constant, we are unaware of it. For instance, are people aware of the fact that they're breathing every moment? You only become aware that you're breathing when you stop breathing, when somebody is trying to suffocate you, or you are in a situation where you cannot breathe anymore. Then you suddenly realize your problem.
Or you bring the awareness to the breath.
Exactly. The normal condition is you're not thinking about breathing, your body is breathing, right? The same applies to any aspect of being alive. But what I was driving at every nanosecond of our life, a process, just like breathing, a process is going on inside of us that is in our mind. Consciousness is the mind. It is going on, and that struggle is the struggle between memory and forgetting. The aspect of forgetting is part of keeping a memory alive. That's the struggle. The brain is functioning, and people, as new information is being inputted by the individual through whatever that individual is doing, that data space in our head is making room by forgetting other things which are not important. That's exactly what we do now on the computer disk. So the forgetting in the natural world of our mind is an aspect of memory. There is memory, and there is the forgetting of that memory to make space for new memory, for new information to be encoded. As we get older, amnesia is the extreme example of forgetting, when the memory has been all wiped out. And no new memory can be encoded because the disk has collapsed, failed. Maybe the new science that we're heading towards will be how to revive the hard disk. The mind is the software. The software functions on the hardware. What is the hardware? That is the brain. The software are the neurons. So we are heading in the direction where at some point in time, we will find that the people whose hardware, the brain, has gone out of normal function of that person, can be repaired. The hardware can be brought alive. I don't know. I'm not a neurosurgeon. I'm not a brain specialist, but I'm saying from the point of view of expectation, that's the direction we're going. That's part of the artificial intelligence work. You see? So, but what I am driving at, forgetting and memory is a constant work going on every second of the day. It's like our heart is pumping, but it is pumping simultaneously one side, the red blood, which is the oxygenated blood, and on the other side, it is pumping in the blue blood that is coming back from the rest of the body to be oxygenated, right? So there's blue blood and red blood, the deoxygenated blood and the oxygenated. So that our body is the most unique creation, of which the mind is one of the central organs. It is the mind that gives us the brain, through the mind that gives us our humanity. Because every other living creature has, in the animal world, has some sort of the organs that you and I have. But what is missing, or at least we don't know, is what is their mind until they begin to communicate to us, right? They do have some communication, but it is at the animal level. It is our mind that makes us who we are, and this is an extraordinary organ in us. So forgetting, and we have to acknowledge that. Now, the forgetting can take place by a natural process as the capacity of the brain starts diminishing, declining, or is damaged by an external factor or an internal factor, humor, cancer, so on and so forth. But in a normal circumstances, the forgetting happens by our choice, that is free, our volition. Somebody has been abused. Somebody has been raped. Somebody has been hurt in some altercation which was legal or whatever, sports, but there's things happening. And that person then wants to forget that. And that's the deliberate act. Wants to get on with life, cannot carry the pains indefinitely. So the child abuse we're talking about, child, abused at age 5, 6, 7, whatever, a victim of pedophilia. That child, as it grows older and older, grows up in an abnormal situation where the child lacks trust in the adult, but the child can no longer describe what the adult had done to him or her when they were a child. One of the symptoms of that abuse is the low level of trust that such abused people have about the other. But to get along with life, that abused person wants to shut off that memory. But that memory will haunt him or haunt her. Mm-hmm. That is the Sigmund Freud's great contribution, to reach back to the time when that abuse took place, to help that individual reach back to the time when the abuse took place, and then work through that process back. So now the child knows why he does not trust people around him. Now, once he knows, he has overcome the problem. Mm-hmm. He can return in some ways to a normal relationship with the others, whether it is within the family or whether it is with strangers.
Yes, that's a big topic. One that I'm very familiar with.
Yes.
Bringing the memory in my work, we bring the memory into the present moment where it can be, we bring that awareness into the present moment where it can be, then we call it transmuted, changed, permanently changed, whether that be one piece at a time or big chunks. Sometimes it comes in different ways, but transmuting is the factor. And I'll put in here I call them the 3 powers, and the 3 powers are love, forgiveness, and gratitude. Those are the 3 powers when bringing any trauma or any memory that we have suppressed into the present so it can be changed. Those are the 3 powers that have the ability to make that change, especially within the emotional body. It changes when we go into the mental body and we look at dualities. But when we're working through the emotional body, which is extensive, we use those 3 powers. Those are the powers that change within the emotional body. So with that, can we jump a little bit into a completely different topic? I was contemplating this morning about, we're all thinking about the Middle East. And one of the things that really stands out for me is emotionality, and partly because that's a big part of my work, but it's just everywhere I look, there seems to be this stuck emotionality. And then that took me into another feeling of, in that in that place where people become very emotionally triggered, that is a very vulnerable place for people to be, and very easily then manipulated. So that's something that can you speak on that? Maybe give us a brief history of how that could have possibly come into the present from, from long past, that manipulation, that programming, that division, that divisiveness that we're seeing playing out right now. And I might add here that this is the time it must stop. We cannot continue this divisive, emotionally led conflicts with one another as human, as our human family. So can you speak on that, Salim?
Well, different cultures and different societies have dealt and have been dealing with these problems for the longest while, and they've developed different approaches or techniques based upon the values they hold dear in terms of their religious tradition, their faith. Mm-hmm. So we in the West, as Christendom, deals with the problem that you're trying to describe, or that you're dealing with, that you see around you, what you have termed as emotionality, which can break out in conflict among individuals, between people, tribes, if you're talking about an area which is divided along tribal lines and association, and in the larger sense among nations, countries, wars that happen, and the effects of those conflicts that breaks out, going through the individual ultimately to the collective, have lasting effects. And the issue is, how do we come about making some way of reconciling our differences, that we can set these conflicts aside, rationalize them, and then therefore, in the process of rationalizing and understanding them, go to the process of therapy. What is therapy? The cure. Therapy is the cure, right? Is the process of understanding the source of emotions and emotionality that triggers conflict. In the West, that is in Christendom, the approach is taken in the largest sense on that one dimensional plane of life, in terms of the time that life has been lived, or the nation, and in terms of the time that the nation has been living, and that is history. We go into the history of the individual, we go into the history of the nation, and we develop all the various tools in human affairs to find a way to communicate with each other, and find, that is to mediate the conflicts with each other, as individuals and as groups, as collectives, as nations, in which, through the mediation, we will arrive at recognizing each other's demands as legitimate, and provide the solution. This is diplomacy, this is politics, and the tools that we have is historical understanding. We recently went through in Canada with the Truth and Reconciliation Committee, right? I mean, in your part of the country, was very important. That is, the whole issue of the First Nation and their history with the people who came from the old world, that is Europe, and the meeting of the people from Europe and the meeting of the people of the First Nation, even though the First Nation itself came from somewhere, but they were here for eons longer than the people who came from the old world, Europe. And that meeting was very traumatic, at least for the First Nation people, because their cultures, their values were in some ways overrun by the cultures and values that was brought from the old world, and so on. And we are still struggling with that. But that is at that one-dimensional plane of life in the here and now. And our life, as the Bible says, is 80 years and 10. And so a human life, an individual life of 80 and 10. And the life of a nation, that we're going through, it spreads over centuries. In contrast to the way we deal with these problems is the tradition from the East. And the tradition from the East, from India, for instance, which is what I can share with you, is the Vedantic tradition of the Hindus, the scriptural tradition of the Hindus. And one of the central idea in this tradition, the Hindu tradition, the Vedantic tradition, is our lives as individual, you and I as individual, is not just this one life at this one moment in time. Our lives are a continuum of many previous lives, of many previous existence. Or to put it in another way, many previous conscience. And as we have already discussed, life is memory, story. So the stories that we carry encoded in us, you as Illia, I as Salim, is the story of this instance in time. The disc in our head is only the contemporary disc in our head, that is memory. What is missing in this tradition, the Vedantic tradition, Hindu tradition, is the memory, the disc of our previous conscience, of a previous existence, our previous lives, because this life is one expression of this continuity of life through many births and deaths till there will be an end to it, a resolution to life, that is to our births and death. And what is being born and what is dying and then what is being born again is our soul. That is life. That the idea of soul is also in Christendom. Our soul. We will go at our death to God's kingdom, and we will go there through the due process of repentance, atonement, and seeking salvation, which is recognizing in this life, that is the soul has done and come to terms with. The wrongs have been corrected. The rights have been expanded. The good has been rewarded and the evil has been punished. We go through that process to balance out what is the record, the memory that is encoded in us of the rights and wrongs we have done in this life, you as Illia and I as Salim, and everyone else. In the Vedantic tradition, the idea is, the notion is that yes, we have done all of this in this life. This is what they call and it's called karma. What is karma? It's a Sanskrit word meaning the entire web of our existence within which we are bound, the cause and the effect. So each of us is a memory of cause and effect. Each of us are carrying this ball, or this threads, this cobweb within which we exist, of this cause and effect brought about as a result of our actions. But what we are carrying is not only of this life, but of all our previous lives. Because this life at this moment, 2023, is the sum total of all the lives we have lived, that is, our soul have gone through before 2023. 1923, 1823, 1723, so on and so forth. At some point, this soul was born, and the soul has gone through this process. Why is the soul going through these so many processes? Why is there so many lives and not one life, which is the Christian way of looking at it? And the answer is, from the Vedantic tradition, that the soul, each soul at any moment in time, at any given moment in time that is born, that takes on life, starts absorbing the cobwebs of cause and effect. A child is born, comes out of the mother's womb, and immediately, in fact, in the mother's womb, now we know from medical science that in the mother's womb, the child can be affected by what happens or what the mother is doing. If the mother, for some reason, gets addicted to whatever drug or alcohol, that will affect the child.
Even emotional responses.
Pardon?
Even emotional response.
Yeah.
Felt by the child. Mm-hmm.
Right.
Yeah.
So the soul that the child is will be affected. So the entirety of that child coming out of the mother's womb and going on is the collection of the cobweb of cause and effect. And so there are stages of life in this Vedantic tradition that they talk about in a religious way, but it can be analyzed, and that's what you and I are doing. And the stages of life in the Vedantic tradition and the Hindu tradition, there are 4 stages of life, 4, points or dramas through which, 4 acts through which each soul makes his entry into the world at this time, 2023, and goes through till it dies. So there's first stage, second stage, third stage, and the 4th stage is that comes to the end. So the first stage is defined by the Sanskrit word brahmacharya, that is the birth of the child and the first act in his drama. Let's say the first act is 20 years. So in this 20 years, brahmacharya is defined as being a student, a learner. The child starts learning to walk, to talk, to eat in and within his family. This learning to talk, walk, eat, and do all that a child does and is taught to be done to do is the cobweb of cause and effects that is binding him, making him into what he will be as a young adult by the time he reaches the age of 20. He's a brahmacharya, he's learning. He has not done anything on his own volition in that largest sense of the term. She is a brahmachari, a child growing into an adolescent and learning the ways of the world around him. Then opens the second act. The second act is called grihastha, which means he or she becomes a family person. That means they now assume responsibility. In the first stage, there is no responsibility that has been assumed. His and her caretaking has been done by the family. If he has no family, if he lost his parents, the tribe, the extended family, is part of the clan. In the second stage, in Grihastha stage, he and she acquires or begins to acquire a family of their own. And with the family comes the responsibility. That means now he or she is going to act on their own volition. They're going to get married, cohabitate, whatever in the modern Canadian terms, no fault marriage or, cohabitation. But those are obligations that are assumed. And this stage of life carries on for the next 40 years in a Canadian setting or in an American setting, he acquires a profession, she acquires a profession, they have a family and so on. But it's all choices made, that is the act of volition. And the cobweb that now comes to encircle him and her is of their own volition. Then that individual enters the third stage of life. And that third stage of life is called in Sanskrit vanaprastha, which means he's going to prepare for his retirement. She will prepare for retirement. So we reach a stage of senior citizen. And then we're done with what we are doing in terms of our professional life, And it is in this stage of life that the individual has to prepare himself and herself to begin the unwinding of the cobwebs, that is the karma, cause and effects, that he had accumulated in the second stage. We pay off our mortgage of the house that we invested in the second stage. You bought a house, that means we got a mortgage, and by the time we enter the third stage, we're working hard to pay up our mortgage so that, we have unwound that obligation. We have children, we work hard, we have taught them, educated them, helped them get their own profession. They've gotten married, now they have their own children. We're unwinding our responsibility, that is our karma, that cobweb, and we're getting out of it. Okay, so that's a process. It takes time. And when you have done that, you enter the final stage, which is sannyasin. Sannyasin is the stage where the individual walks away from the world. Figuratively, we cannot walk away from the world. We cannot drop off the planet. But walks away from the world is now in his third stage. He has unwound all of the cobweb, the commitments, the obligations, the cause and effects of his life. He has unwound it and he's handed it over. And now in the fourth stage, he is liberated. He has no obligation, no cobweb to acquire. And he walks away. And he prepares for his departure in this life from this world. That's the last and final stage. So if you put all of that together in this particular tradition, the stages is acquisition of karma, cause and effect. First, you're not born with it, it is handed to you. In the second stage, you acquire it out of your own volition. In the third stage, you start unwinding process. And when you have done that, you enter the fourth stage, where you are liberated in the sense that you no longer have any further responsibility. And now you can take care of your own needs in the sense of your spiritual salvation. All right? This is the accounting process. What are you accounting for? That's where, again, the memory comes in. unless you have forgotten it. But if you haven't forgotten it, and your memory comes in of this life, and you know that I did X and Y and Z, that was in a sense harmful to others, and I did A, B, and C, but that did not do any harm to anybody. And the question is of balancing it, the cause and effect, the good and the bad. And if you cannot balance it in this life, the soul's life, that is on the fourth stage, then you have to come back. You will be given another opportunity. Nature provides you with another opportunity. Nature or God, in the Indian context, God is the super soul, the oversoul, the only intellect. God has many manifestations, so there are gods and goddesses, but the ultimate idea is there's only one oversoul. And the journey of the soul from the state of birth to the final state of death is the journey to the oversoul, which is nirvana, where the soul will never come back anymore. You have reached your kingdom of God. But to reach the kingdom of God, you have to free yourself. Your soul has to become totally liberated from all of the karma that the soul has acquired over one life or many lives. And so emotionality is what is, in the Indian context, even in the North American context or Christian context, is the ego. And all that the ego seeks to acquire to satisfy the ego. The accumulation of all of what the ego wants. It wants power, it wants money, it wants sex, it wants whatever it is. What the ego wants in terms of acquisition is, in a sense, a deprivation for the other. If the ego is addicted by sexuality, that ego, whether it is male or female, is looking for sexual fulfillment of that ego's need. It doesn't care about the other through whom this ego, the male ego, we normally talk about the male ego, the sexual predator. So the male ego, who is a sexual predator, couldn't care less about the female. The female is simply an object of his satisfaction, to his addiction. So how does that soul, that is the male soul, driven by his ego of accumulation, how is that soul going to unwind its responsibility and account for what it has done to all the other souls, female souls, in the process of fulfilling his predatory needs? And that's where the journey of the soul becomes so vital, that is birth and rebirth. Because he will either have to find, that soul will either have to find a way to balance out, that is to compensate those souls that have been damaged because of his volition. He has to find out a way to balance it, or he has to come back and face the consequences in his next life. In other words, he has to experience as a victim what he did as a victimizer. Now, this act of balancing is the unwinding process, because at the end of the day, the balancing is that the soul must be totally liberated from all of the accumulated karma, which is voluntary act of that soul in this journey. And that, that process is the process of recollection of memories of past lives. of separating the conscious soul from his and her karma, whether those karmas were acquired within that biblical terms of 80 years and 10, or whether it was acquired over many, many lives.
Yes.
There is, in this argument or in this hypothesis, in this tradition, there is no escape from karma. And awakening, in that larger sense, is awakening to that reality that, we cannot escape from our deeds. So the deeds that we engage in should be deeds in which no harm is done to other souls.
Yes, that's what I'm getting at. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. That
so in the life of a country, there are many lives that are happening at the same time over a much extended period. So what is the lesson have we learned? Jesus says, blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be the children of God. Now, if you analyze the term, blessed are the peacemakers are people who not only wants to end conflict, who want to end conflict within their own souls. Because again, Jesus says, and this is from the Gospel of Matthew, Mark, or Luke, or John. In the Gospel of Matthew, you find about Jesus talking about take the beam out of your eyes before you take the mole out of the eyes of your brothers. Why take the beam out of your eyes? Let me reach for my Bible, I sitting right on the top shelf. Why take the beam out of our eyes? Well, Jesus says, as if I can quickly find the passage, it is in Matthew. Yeah. Matthew 6, verses 22, 23, Jesus says, the light of the body is the eye. If therefore thine eye be single, thy whole body shall be full of light. But if thine eye be evil, thy whole body shall be full of darkness. If therefore the light that is in thee be darkness, how great is that darkness? So when Jesus says, take the beam out of your eyes, he's telling you, awaken your conscience, because that's the metaphor being used. Well, this is Jesus's metaphor, Plato's metaphor, the oldest metaphor, or one of the oldest metaphor in the Western tradition, Western history, is the cave. People are in a cave with their back turned to the mouth of the cave, and they're looking at the walls, and the light that is falling on the wall in the cave are shadows, and the people are afraid of the shadows. And the job of a teacher, of a prophet, of a mentor, of a sage, is the job of helping the people turn around and face the light. And once they do that, the shadow has disappeared, because the shadow was themselves. The shadow that was on the wall, of which they were terrified, what was the shadow? It was their own shadow. They were the demons. But once light goes through in the cave, they're awakened. As Jesus says, open your eyes, take the beam out of your eyes. So once the light goes through you, your inside becomes lightened. You're no longer dark. Darkness is the metaphor of evil. We are individuals walking at all times when we are unaware of ourselves. We are walking at all times with beams in our eyes. It doesn't matter who we are. Kings, emperors, prime ministers, presidents, popes, bishops, on and on and on. Professors, doctors. In fact, I would say the people who carry the beam, the biggest beam in their eyes, are the people who have got the most power, most wealth,
Right.
most of whatever it is. That is their ego. The ego becomes the beam in their eyes.
It's an override.
That's
Override.
right.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And it is in the Indian tradition, that is the karma. The ego, the soul carries all the wrappings of your own doings. Nobody else has done it. There's a war, there are war going on over here. And people go from one to the other without pausing and thinking, what are they going into? They're supporting Ukraine 2 days ago. Now they're supporting Israel, China, United States, whatever. Is the soul in me, in you, in the child that is born, a Canadian soul, an Indian soul, a Chinese soul, a Jewish soul, a Christian soul, a Hindu soul? No. The soul is the pure breath in the Christian tradition, in the Islamic tradition, in the Jewish, is in the Hindu tradition, is the breath of God. It is pure and it has no ego, no id, is the breath of God, that is of the intellect. And then begins the journey of that soul in human condition, and it starts acquiring an ego and id. That is karma. And the awakening is to recognize that I was the pure breath of God. I was from Him a gift to my parents, to my society, but I am not what my parents or the society or what they are, you know. I was taught to be a Christian. I was taught to be a Jew. I was taught to be a Hindu. I was taught to be a Muslim. Can we unlearn being all of that and become again a pure soul? And that's in the Indian tradition, the 4 stages of life. The soul in the final stage is now ready to go home because he has completely, liberated himself from all the karma, that is, from all that is of the ego. And now it is ready to be back with the oversoul that was the breath of which he was the particle. And now, so this is a metaphysical explanation, In the physical explanation is, this is what the education is all about. The education is all about trying to be human in that universal sense and recognizing that we live in particular situation. An Eskimo lives in a climate where he makes his home with ice blocks. And a Bedouin nomad lives in the desert in Sahara, and he learns how to make his home with camel and date palm trees. So that is the particular situation. Or we, in the most advanced modern countries, we learn to make our home in skyscrapers and demolish nature around the building of skyscrapers. each in particular situation. But all of these people, in whatever particular situation they are, there's a universality within them. I would tell my student that we are 8 billion people on the earth at this moment in time. So we have 8 billion fingerprints. Each of the fingerprint in our thumb is unique. In an illiterate society or uneducated society, people still use the fingerprint to sign a document. Each fingerprint is unique. But I would tell my students that if you need a kidney, if you need a heart, my kidney can function in your body. My kidney, my heart, my organs is my universality with you.
Thank you.
My kidney, my heart, my blood is neither black or yellow or green. It is universal.
Thank you, Salim. I feel that's a really good spot to complete our time together today. Yeah. Thank you so much for taking.
Thank you for having me. And thank you for this exchange.
I hope to that we can meet again in person one day.
God willing.
Yeah.
Most definitely.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Goodbye.